point in the course, we've learned how to assess landscape conditions and how to analyze and prepare our soil. We've also tackled the morphological, physiological, and ecological considerations in plant species selection, while keeping in mind our personal preferences and aesthetics. Now we'll use practical plant physiology to choose or avoid plants at the nursery. We'll be focusing on trees and shrubs since they are the backbones of our permanent landscapes, and they can cost a lot of money too. It's tempting when we're plant shopping to zoom in on plants and say instant impact. We buy the biggest trees possible even though they can cost hundreds of dollars. And we're drawn to trees pruned to look like miniature adults rather than left in their straggly but natural teenage form. In many cases, we've just become impatient with waiting and we want the perfect landscape now. We've started to regard trees and shrubs as design elements rather than the living, changing organisms they are. As we examine sample nursery specimens here in the studio, we'll learn to look for key indicators of hidden flaws. We'll learn about taper and root flares and suckers and grafts. We'll inspect the trunks and branches for signs of improper pruning. And finally, we'll get down and dirty looking for clues about circling roots, trunk rot, and other avoidable flaws. Half the battle to successful tree and shrub planting is starting out with healthy plants. We brought a number of purchased plants into the studio. Let's see if they get a clean bill of health. And if not, let's discuss whether there's anything we can do about it. First of all, let's consider the types of plant materials that you might be able to find at the nursery. We've got bare rootstock, which you won't see any of here because we're filming this in the fall. And bare rootstock is only available during a very small part of the year, usually in the late winter or early spring. They're only available when they're dormant. And they're also relatively small. If you're looking for instant impact, bare rootstock is not for you. But they are generally the best quality plants because you can see that you have healthy roots. The second type of plant material you can find very easily are things that are in containers. And the containers aren't filled with soil. Instead, they're filled with soilless media. This encourages root growth. It's light and easy to manage. It's easy to pack. But there is an issue with it that we'll discuss later on in this lecture. Then finally, we have something like a balled and burlap material. And the ball itself is filled with clay. It's covered with burlap. And sometimes we call this B&B rather than balled and burlapped. The reason it's filled with clay is it has to hold together when this is dug and covered and then shipped. We'll discuss why this is a problem later on in the lecture in terms of the clay that's in the ball. These might be the largest trees available, but they do come with some serious root problems, and we'll discuss this a lot more in an upcoming lecture. Then we want to start assessing the general health of plants at the nursery. We want to look for evidence of weeds, of pests, diseases, and perhaps nutritional issues. It's kind of like choosing a daycare for your children. You don't want neglected plants. After you do an overall assessment, you want to start looking at specific plants. And we'll start by looking at shoots. And all of this information is also included in your guidebook. It's a checklist, so you can take this to the nursery. First, you want to see if there's evidence of inappropriate pruning. This is a very common problem that happens in nurseries, either at the nursery itself, the retail nursery, or sometimes at the production nursery. Sometimes trees are cut down or topped to make them smaller. This is a real problem in terms of further growth because this pruning will increase further growth, and then you'll have this hydra, multi-headed hydra that you have to continually maintain. On the other hand, some trees naturally have a multi-trunked appearance, and it's okay if those have been pruned. Same with shrubs. You expect them to be pruned a bit because they're bushier, but single-trunk trees should stay single-trunk trees, and we'll see some examples of that. Later on, as these trees grow, and if they've been pruned, you'll get competing leaders, which are sometimes called codominants, and that leads to some health problems down the road that we'll be discussing in an upcoming lecture. When you're looking at the trees, you should be able to see side branches. They're all up and down the side of the trunk. They're usually pretty short, kind of hairy looking. It's kind of like a teenager, you know, they're kind of straggly, kind of hairy, but you've got to have those side branches, and they play a really important role. One of these roles is shading. The bark of young trees is very fragile, and these smaller branches and their leaves will shade the bark to keep it from getting sunburned. They also provide food to the trunk that's connected to those branches. The sugars that are formed in the leaves travel back down to the trunk, and they're stored there to feed the trunk as it grows. So food and shading are two important traits that these branches provide for the trunk. If you remove these little branches because you want it to look nice and neat and clean, you're going to have trunk scorch from exposure to sun, and your trunk isn't going to be as healthy because it doesn't have that food source that it would have had you left those branches in place. Next, we'll consider taper. And what taper is what happens to the tree as you're looking up about eye height, or wherever the trunk starts on your tree, and then moving down to the soil. And it should move down, and as it gets to the soil, it's going to flare out. And this is a really important structure that develops naturally in trees as they're exposed to wind and other kinds of movement. So you have that area that's a little bit thicker and fatter, which helps hold the tree in place during things like wind or other types of mechanical disturbance. So you want to be able to see that. If you don't see it, that could mean you have a problem underground, which we'll also see later. Then we need to look for grafts. A lot of trees that you'll find have been grafted onto really vigorous rootstock, which is great because it means you can grow some rather unusual trees on rootstock that will survive your conditions. But on the other hand, that rootstock can be so vigorous that it might overtake the graft, and then you're going to have some problems. So we'll look for evidence of that as well. And then finally, and this seems really obvious, you have to look for signs of damage or disease. Most of the time, these things are called out before they get to the retail nursery, but you'd be surprised what can slip through the cracks. Then we're going to have to get down on your hands and knees and look at the roots and look at the container and start assessing root quality as much as you can without taking the whole thing apart. You get to do that when you get home, but you can't do it at the nursery. One of the first things you want to determine is whether the size of the container is big enough for the plant. And this is a very difficult thing to describe, this height to size ratio. There's not a good number for it. So what I have is a very complicated test called the tippy test. If it's something where it's going to tip over, or it looks like it's going to tip over, that probably means that the top is too big for the size of the container. And if it looks like it's going to fall over, you can pretty much bet that the roots are going to be very constricted in there. When you look at a young tree or shrub and you see lots of above ground growth, that means you're going to have a lot of below ground growth too. So if you have a tree that has grown up a couple feet, you know that its roots are growing also a couple feet. And if they have a very small container, they're going to be wrapping around and around and around in that container. So that's something to be aware of. You don't want something to fail the tippy test because there'll be a nightmare inside that pot once you get it off. While you're down there looking at the container, look for surface roots. The surface roots are ones that obviously have come up to the surface and started growing over the top, and while they might look kind of neat and kind of bonsai-ish, it's nothing you really want in your plants. What it means is there's some kind of problem underground. Maybe it's been in the pot too long, the roots have no place else to grow but up, maybe it's not been potted up properly, but there is some problem underground that is made visible by those surface roots. And if you want a challenge, by all means, buy something with surface roots. But if you want your life to be easy, avoid those plants at all costs. Then we're going to look for the root flare. I mentioned this before when I talked about taper. And taper goes from a narrower point to a wider point. And that wider point is called the root flare. And this is where the roots meet the trunk. It's that transitional tissue. And it's a really important structure. If you look at a tree that's in nature, you will always see these flares. The ones that have grown from seed, that's just the way they naturally grow, and they always taper out as they reach the ground, and then the roots start below that. You need to be able to see this. That means that your plant is planted at grade. So at grade means that it's at the proper level. It's not planted too high. It's not planted too low. It's at grade, and the taper is the at grade point. If it's planted too high, your roots can dry out. If it's planted too low, you can suffocate the roots, and you can also get diseases that occur underneath the soil along where the trunk has been buried. And finally, we're going to look for suckers. Suckers are those stems that are popping up from the roots themselves and competing with your tree. And if you have a multi-trunk species, something that normally has many trunks popping up, that's not a problem. It's these single trunk species you need to think about. Because if you have suckers coming up, it means you probably have a problem underground. So if you see a whole bunch of trees in the nursery, all of them, the same species, have a single trunk, and one of them has suckers, that definitely means there's a problem underground with the roots. What the plant is doing at this point is dwarfing itself. This means that it's making a smaller tree that's easier to get water to because of the root problems that aren't allowing water to get up to the top of the existing crown. So eventually, over time, this existing crown is going to die back, and these suckers will form the new crown. So don't even get a plant that's like that, because it's just a nightmare as that plant starts to age, and you're having to constantly take care of it and probably fix the roots before you even plant it. So avoid plants that have suckers unless, again, it happens to be a multi-trunk species. And then finally, of course, damage or disease. You don't want anything that has damaged or diseased tissues. A few leaves that have been diseased maybe at the end of the season are not a problem, but if you've got damage to the trunk, the bark, anything that's a permanent structure, avoid it. These are normally culled out by the nursery before they would go out onto retail, but sometimes things do slip through. So now you've had the theory, let's put it into practice. We've got a bunch of plants here to look at. Let's see how their quality matches up to our checklist. We're going to start just by thinking about the overall quality of plants at the nursery. So this coneflower is a beautiful specimen. Nice flowers, foliage looks great. There's a little bit of insect damage, which isn't really a problem. You don't want a nursery that has no insects, because that means they're using way too many pesticides, and that's just not a good sign. So a little bit of insect damage is just fine. The one thing I do see on here, however, is some leaf chlorosis. And we've been talking about the problems with too much phosphate, and this is one of the symptoms of that is interveinal chlorosis. So I wouldn't be surprised if this had been over-fertilized. But all in all, it's a pretty good quality plant. So that's one indicator that this is probably from a fairly well-maintained nursery. You also might want to look for things like weeds. And it's not necessarily, again, that weeds are a bad thing. It's just that, especially with this particular weed, it's oxalis. And if you're a gardener and you've seen oxalis before, you know it's something you don't want in your landscape. And sure, if you're at the nursery, you'd probably be like me and you'd pull these out and leave them there and take the plant with you. But do keep in mind that there's going to be seeds in there. So you don't want to be taking this plant because it's going to be full of those weed seeds, and you want to avoid that at all costs. Now let's look at some of the shoot issues that we discussed. So here we've got this beautyberry. It's a shrub. And you'll notice that it has been pruned on the top. It's not a tree, so it's okay that this has been topped. This is natural for its form. It's got multiple stems. It's a shrub. It does well when it gets sheared like this, so it's perfectly fine that this has been pruned. And if you had this at home, you would also keep it pruned probably in this form. So we can explore through here and see what we can find. Shoots look great. Don't see any indication of damage or disease, just that pruning, which of course is all right. And down here near the soil, it's a little bit hard to see. It's multiple trunk, what you'd expect from a shrub, but I don't see a root flare. So it's really difficult to tell exactly where the root starts, buried a little bit too deeply. And this is a really common problem with a lot of containerized plants. So this isn't to say it's a bad plant, it might be just fine. You won't know though until you get it home and get it out of the pot to find out. So let's consider another shrub. In this case, we'll look at a crepe myrtle, which you could consider to be a shrub or a small tree, depending on where you live and how big they get. And this is an interesting specimen. Now they are starting to go dormant. This is a common response. Obviously in the fall, you're gonna have the leaves falling off of deciduous species. So that's not really a problem. It's hard to assess leaf health, of course, if the leaves are falling off, but there's other things we can look at. One of the things that is kind of distressing with this particular specimen is we've got some dead branches in here. This is something that is natural for this species because it is a multi-trunk species, but if it was my nursery and I was selling this plant, I would have pruned out these dead branches. They're not a problem, it doesn't mean it's diseased, it's just old wood and it's died back. So that's a little bit of a concern in terms of how well managed this particular plant is, and maybe all the plants at that nursery. The thing that's most concerning to me, however, is looking down at the soil under all these dead leaves, is it looks like we have 3 different plants in the pot. You really don't know for sure. It could be 3 different plants, in which case all the roots are going to be knotted together in this incredible mass that you are going to hate once you take it out of the pot. Or it could be that it's planted way too deep, and these are all coming out of one single crown that's buried deeply under the surface. We don't know until we get it taken apart. But that concern for me would be one that I would not buy this plant because I don't want to have to figure out what's going on underground and spend all that time taking care of it. So these have all been container plants. This is our next container plant, and this is a Japanese maple, and it is an interesting specimen for lots of different reasons. I think this is my favorite one to assess. So you can tell it's a little bit sad, starting to die back. Again, this is natural for this time of year. It is autumn, but you'll see 2 branches are doing very well, and that's this branch here and this branch over here. And this is a grafted specimen. So the graft for itself is right here. It looks fine. There's not any kind of disease issue with it. But this tree has not been managed well in the nursery, because what you would do if you were managing this tree was you would prune off this branch here and this branch here because it's part of the rootstock. And remember, I mentioned in terms of grafting, you have vigorous rootstocks to support these grafted materials, and you've got to keep the rootstock materials out of there. So completely different leaf. It's doing quite well. So the reason, part of the reason this has died back early is because all the resources are going to the rootstock branches instead. So that's a management issue that would be of concern in terms of, are people really taking care of their plants once they get on site? Looking at the rest of the tree, the grafted part, you'll notice up here at the top, there's a couple of branches that are very close together. This should be pruned out because they're so close together that eventually they're going to fuse, and then you're going to have this big fused mass up here that is going to be prone to breakage. So you've got some crossing branches that once, if you did buy this, you would want to prune some of this out to get that problem out of there. And then moving down to the roots, which is always an excitement thing for me, and you'll see why in an upcoming lecture. You can see that we've got a nightmare root system here. There's surface roots all over the place, and the ones that are there are going straight down. What this means is when this plant was potted up however many times, the roots weren't straightened out before it was put into the larger pot. And woody roots do not miraculously straighten themselves once they get into a bigger pot. They're woody. It'd be like straightening out part of this table. It's wood. So they are still going straight down, looking like giant carrots, rather than going out like spokes on a wheel. So I can pretty much guarantee you that when you pull this out, you're going to have a real problem root system to take care of. Doesn't mean you can't take care of it, but it is a problem to be aware of, and you may not want to buy that particular plant. Finally, let's consider this yew here, which is in a balled and burlapped form, and you can see that there are some weeds in it, and that's actually okay. What the weeds are telling you is that this is a field-grown tree. It hasn't been in a pot. You may not have the same kinds of root problems that we've seen that we'll probably have with some of the containerized material. So this is one of the reasons that balled and burlap trees cost so much money. They have to be grown in the field. They've been grown there for several years. That takes time, it takes money, and you're going to get charged more for it. But as I said, this indicates that it was a field-grown tree, and that's a good sign. Don't worry about the weeds or seeds. This is clay. It's going to have a lot of stuff in it, but hopefully, along with weed seeds, it's going to have some good roots. So what you want to do, and you can do this with all these plants, is do a little bit of peeking around to see what the roots look like. We can't obviously open this all the way up, but we can pull the burlap away so that we can see if we can find the root crown. Now what I'm finding here is multiple trunks, which is fine. This is a yew. It's a shrubby type of conifer. It is not a problem to have it have multiple branches down that low, but I'm not finding a root flare. That doesn't mean that it's not right up there, but I can't see it, and unless I took the whole ball apart, I wouldn't be able to find it. But it appears, just because I've been doing this for a while, that it's probably near the top there, so it's probably okay. I would take my chances on this tree just because it has been field grown and because I think I can figure out where the root flare is. And the rest of the tree looks great. The foliage looks nice and healthy, so no indications of any any diseases or any other types of problems that you might find with yew trees. Let me mention that also with some of this containerized material, that you can look at the roots a little bit too. It's perfectly okay to pull these out of this pot gently and look to see what the roots look like. So you can see that this is all held together in a pretty dense mass. The roots are white, which means they're alive, and it's pretty much root bound. So you have to consider that when you're buying this on whether or not you want to deal with a root-bound tree. Now, if you pull this out and all the media falls out, that means it hasn't been in the pot very long, and then you've got an interesting conversation with the nursery. So what happens if you end up getting a low-quality plant and you really want it? Let's say that this was the only Japanese maple on the lot, and you really wanted it, even though you knew there was problems with it. Well, there's a number of things you can do. And you can consider these to be rescue plants. In fact, if you want to practice the techniques we'll be talking about this course, the best thing you can do is go to the nursery, go to the sales section where things have been there a long time, buy something cheap, and it's a good thing to practice on. When you get things home, you might be disappointed in how they look after they've been in your garden or your landscape even just still in the pot for a few days, they may not look as great as they did in the nursery. And you may wonder why. You may wonder, did I get a lemon plant? Well, what you need to think about is that nurseries are kind of like ICUs at hospitals. The plants there are getting constantly managed in terms of lots of water, lots of fertilizer, making sure that there's not any weeds. They're just getting all that management that they're probably not going to get at your house. So don't worry if your plant doesn't look as great when you get it home. That's perfectly natural, and it will look great once you do get it planted into the landscape. If you want a comparison on what it might look in your landscape, go to some of the big box stores where they maybe aren't as careful with watering and fertilizing and see what they look like. And they don't look quite as good as the plants that you'll find in the nurseries. So give it some time. Let the plants recover. If it's a bad time to plant, just leave them in the pots for a while. You may want to think about where you're going to put them. It's a lot easier to move them in the containers, various parts of your landscape, rather than trying to figure it out after you've already planted it. So when you get it home, take out the dead, the damaged, the diseased materials that you might be able to find. For this tree, for example, you could go through and you could prune out, obviously, the suckers from the rootstock. You could prune out the crossing branches, but nothing else. Just take out the things that are a problem right then. We'll discuss other types of pruning a little bit later in the course. When you're finally ready to pot, you're going to do something that's a little bit controversial. You're going to take everything off of the roots. You're going to take off the pots, obviously, although I have seen things have been planted in the pots in the ground. You're going to take off the burlap. You're going to take off any twine, wire baskets, and then all of the media or all of the soil. And this is the part that kind of surprises people, because you may have heard, as I did when I was working on my PhD, that you're not supposed to disturb the root balls because it'll collapse and the tree will die. And that was pounded into our little heads as we were learning all about horticulture. It turns out that's really bad advice. The much better thing to do from a scientific viewpoint is to get rid of all those barriers. Our goal when we're planting is to get everything off the roots so that they're bare roots and they're planted into the soil and they're right there. This is why bare root plants do so well, because they are right in touch with the native soil. They get established, they grow, and they do wonderfully. We can do that with our container plants and our B&B plants as well. So you're going to be able to take off all that stuff, bare root your plant, and then there's some neat things you can do. We already know we're going to have some problems with some of the roots with some of these plants, and they can be corrected so they become more likely to establish in your landscape. You also are going to get rid of all that soil there, which is nothing like what's in your landscape. Unless you have a really clayey soil, this is nothing like what's in your landscape. And I can guarantee you that you don't have soilless media in your landscape. Keep that stuff out of the soil. It doesn't belong there. It's a different type of texture than your native soil. So you're removing the barriers, you're taking away this soilless media or clay, you're looking for root problems, you're going to correct those, and you can also look for the root crown. And that's an important thing. You need to find that root crown so that it can be at grade. So these are the things that we're going to learn later on in the course on how exactly to do this. As I said, it is a rather controversial topic, and I'm going to mention that controversy several times because it is important from a horticultural point of view to understand why we do this. This is also good for herbaceous perennials, not so much the root pruning, because you don't need to do that. But when you take them out to plant them, all that media, again, is soilless media. It's coir, and it's perlite, and it's peat, and it's all the stuff that is not soil. It doesn't belong in the hole with your roots. You can use it on top as part of a mulch layer, but it certainly doesn't belong in the hole. So take it off, keep it aside, and use it later as a good organic material. So you'll be restoring the root systems, getting all the material off. But let's say that you get to the point that you've taken everything out and you've got dead and dying roots, you've got disease, things you couldn't see until you got things taken apart. You have an option. You can take things back to the nursery, but there are often restrictions on that. There's often warranties that say if you disturb the root ball, you don't get your money back. So you're going to have to maybe take a little bit of a risk here. And maybe you don't want to take a risk and you just want to plant it and hope that it survives, and you should feel like you can do that. But we really have to start showing the problems to the nurseries. This is not something that is caused by the retail nursery. It's caused way before, during production. So production nurseries long ago used to be pretty much these small operations, often mom and pop types of nurseries, where perhaps they didn't have a lot of information in terms of horticultural science, but they pretty much knew how plants worked because this was their job and this was their business, and they did it for years and years. So they would understand when they were potting things up that they needed to loosen the roots and get them established into the new pots as they went from size to size to size. Nowadays, we don't have the little production nurseries so much. We have big automated systems where there's still workers that are doing the up potting, but a lot of times they're low paid, they don't necessarily have the education or the background in terms of how to move these plants from different size pots, from a smaller pot to a larger pot. And so they'll take them, they'll pop them out, and they'll pop them back in, they'll put some media on top, and they're done. And many times it might be the volume of pots and how they get paid. So the emphasis is on speed here and not on plant health. So the whole point about the root system being a fragile thing and something that needs to be taken care of is pretty much just ignored at the production level because they just aren't spread out and put into the pot as they should be. And so you end up having all these problems that you don't see literally until you get things home and get them unpotted. So what I've encouraged people to do is if you know you have a warranty that isn't going to allow you to get your money back, take pictures. Take pictures of what it looked like before you took it apart, after you took it apart, take it back to your nursery, especially if it's a nursery that you have a friendly relationship with, and explain, I understand this isn't a retail issue, but it is a plant quality issue. And somehow we've got to get production methods to stop making these poor quality plants and get back to this care that needs to be done during potting up, the same care that we're going to put into our plants as we put them into the landscape. So it's time for a change, and that's got to be at the production level. So now you have the tools to select plants from your local nursery that are most likely to thrive in your landscape. Your trained eye now knows how to inspect nursery plants from the crown to the ground, looking for evidence of good and bad production methods. You now know that the biggest isn't necessarily the best, and it's smarter to focus on quality rather than size. And you've learned that even poor quality plants can sometimes be rescued through science-based pruning practices. But finding quality plants is only the beginning of establishing a successful landscape. In the following lectures, we'll look at the specific science-based planting and management practices that will ensure your new plants not only survive, but thrive in your home garden.